Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you all for coming to celebrate with me. 2 years ago, I had the honor and pleasure of speaking here about Jane Austen, about reading Jane Austen, and I'm just thrilled to be back in order to celebrate my book with dear friends and colleagues and about to be friends. It was newly published last month by Bucknell University Press. It's not usual to publish a first academic book at the age of 79. But I didn't write this book for a university promotion and tenure committee. I wrote it for people who love to read Jane Austen and want to read more with and about her. If you're familiar with the conventions of scholarly publication as opposed to trade books, you know that no book gets published without two anonymous readers confirming that the book presents a new, well-researched argument, that it makes a significant contribution to what English scholars call the critical conversation of published research. So yes, my book does have a lot of footnotes. And the first chapter does perform that ritual review of current critical literature to show what amazing new things I'm offering readers. But here's the good news. You don't have to read the footnotes. They're there for those who want them. I wanted my book to be a pleasure to read. The better you know Austen, the more fun it should be. But even if you don't know Austen very well, I hope you'll still find it interesting to read and that it will send you back to read more of Austen's wonderful novels. This book was 3 years in the writing and editing, but really I've been working on it for most of my life. Starting in 1972, when I first began reading and researching for my doctoral dissertation on Austen, which I finally submitted and defended in 1981. I was very thorough. In subsequent decades, I've continued to read and to think about Austen and the literary culture of which she was a part, publishing dozens of essays about Jane Austen and other authors. During this book's long gestation, however, the academic conversation about Austen has changed dramatically. When I first began, as we say, working on Austen as a PhD student in the early 1970s, she was still a sort of cult figure, passionately beloved by older male readers and scholars, and by girls who read Pride and Prejudice when they were 12, but not really known by the general public. And here I have to say that I am in awe of women who read Pride and Prejudice when they were 12, because I tried reading it at that age. I gave up after one chapter. I really didn't care whether Mr. Bennet paid a visit to the new tenant of Netherfield Hall or not. I went back to reading the Brontes, which was much more to my adolescent taste. In the early 1970s, as English departments everywhere were rethinking what the literary canon should be, Austen disappeared from many school and university curriculums. My own friends were reading Marx, Althusser, and Gramsci. My fellow English PhD students were all working on 20th century authors. Meanwhile, there I was in Highbury with Emma Woodhouse or walking on the Cobb in Lyme with Anne Elliot. Austen was still quite niche. Of course, all that changed beginning in 1975, the year of her bicentenary, when many new critical books about Austen appeared. And many of those books were written by young scholars who were embracing new literary theories. Those books kept coming like a tidal swell. 2 decades later, in 1995, we had in quick succession the BBC television adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. That's the Colin Firth wet shirt one. Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility, written by and starring Emma Thompson with a dream cast of her friends. A film of Persuasion, starring Amanda Root, who I think looks exactly like Jane Austen in the one full-face portrait we have of her that her sister did. And brilliantly funny Clueless, starring Alicia Silverstone as Cher, the spoiled Emma character, reimagined as the cool kid in a California high school. These films created quite a stir Austen was off and away as a cultural phenomenon. 6 years earlier, in 1979, a few Jane Austen lovers, mostly scholars and rare book collectors, had gotten together in New York City to found the Jane Austen Society of North America. I attended my first JASNA conference, we call them annual general meetings or AGMs, at Lake Louise in 1993. That was 2 years before the year of the 4 films. It was a wonderful gathering of people who loved Jane Austen, both leading scholars and enthusiastic non-professional readers, coming together to celebrate and to learn from one another. I became an enthusiastic member, and if you're interested, somewhere in the room I've left a little piece of paper with details about membership, or you can just go to, oh, thank you, back there on the table. You can just go to jasna, jasna.org and follow the links. But in 1995, those films changed everything. JASNA gained hundreds of new members worldwide, and Jane Austen gained a celebrity status that she could never have imagined and certainly never sought. She entered popular culture, inspiring dozens of fan fiction prequels, sequels, and spin-offs, and more dramatizations, as well as blogs, listservs, podcasts, graphic novels, and lots of merch. I'm wearing the official reproduction Jane Austen ring. We share a birthstone, both being December babies. What had been a special interest, a niche cult for a few people who liked to feel special, had suddenly become a popular obsession. Some of these new expressions of Janeite fandom were very much in the spirit of her writing, but others, many others, tended to reinsert into her plots and characters all of those romantic novel cliches that she had taken such pains to excise from her own writing. In some cases, I'll name names, notoriously Patricia Rozima's film inaccurately titled Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, they completely reverse the moral equations that Austen had created. And that's important because Austen always wrote against the grain of her readers' expectations. Her contemporaries thought they knew what to expect when they opened the pages of a new novel, but it was part of Austen's writerly strategy to disrupt those readerly expectations and thus to challenge her readers to read freshly, to rethink what novels might be, to read, reflect, and judge as Austen's heroines each must learn to do. So Jane Austen was born in 1775 and grew up as one of the youngest children in a large, lively, literate, witty family, all of whom liked to compose things, sermons, essays, comic verses, amusing letters. Her father, a country parson, never had quite enough cash for his family, but he had a large library and they were all enthusiastic readers, and they read high and low, no discrimination. From an early age, Jane wrote. She added comments to the margins of her books, annotating Tudor history to disparage Elizabeth I and to venerate Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a Jacobite. She wrote fictional names in her father's church's marriage register, inventing marriages. She also wrote funny stories, plays, prayers, poems, and many amusing parodic pieces to entertain her family and close friends. By her late teens, she was writing novels seriously with the intention of publishing them. She also read voraciously and eclectically. Since new books were expensive and hard to come by, this often meant rereading, sharpening her critical faculties on a familiar text. While she read quite a bit on her own, reading was also a communal activity. After dinner, which for a country family like the Austens would mean in daylight, late afternoon, the family would gather around the drawing room, maybe with a fire lit. One person might read aloud from a book while the rest of the women worked with their needles, usually plain mending. But if you had visitors, didn't want them to see the mending, you do your fancy embroidery. And they would talk about what they were reading together. It was like growing up in an unusually clever book club, a book club where everyone actually read the book. So Austen learned to write for readers who shared her knowledge of books, who could easily pick up on allusions to other works, who shared her comic spirit, and who would recognize when she was being ironic. But none of us belong to that book club. We have to work a little harder to recognize her allusions and her irony. In recent decades, Austen's status as a pop cultural figure means that some readers are now coming to her books not because they read Pride and Prejudice when they were 12, but because they watched Jennifer Ely and Colin Firth fall in love, or watched Marianne Dashwood nearly die of a broken heart in 3 successive versions of Sense and Sensibility, or cried when Anne Elliot was finally reunited with the man she had loved hopelessly for over 7 years in 3 versions of Persuasion. Perhaps they also saw one of the witty reimaginings of Austen's stories, films very much in the ironic and parodic spirit of her novels. After Clueless came the hilarious cross-cultural pleasures of the Bollywood-style Bride and Prejudice in 2000, It's Such a Treat, or the clever and convincingly Austen-esque invention of Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies in 2016. I've seen it 3 times, it's really good. Or maybe they're simply seduced by the gorgeous, sensual, post-racial pleasures of Bridgerton. Who doesn't love these adaptations? Beautiful people wearing beautiful clothes in beautiful settings, enjoying deeply satisfying happily ever after resolutions. So today there are many pathways to Jane Austen, which is wonderful. But that also means that newer readers are less likely to be familiar with the history, culture, and material objects of late Georgian England, less likely to be sensitive to the verbal nuances of the period, or to share the assumptions and expectations of Austen's first readers about what to expect as you turn the pages. Austen could safely assume that those first readers carried the same literary models and expressions in their heads as she did. She could take for granted their familiarity with the conventions, plots, and characters of the Georgian novel, even as she thwarts their expectations that her novel, too, will follow those conventions. But most readers today are unfamiliar with Georgian novels, so we're likely to miss much of the resonance of Austen's words, her playing against convention, her ironic inversion of cliché formula. In writing my book, I wanted to get into Jane Austen's head, to investigate how she played with readerly expectations. I wrote the book to reread Austen's works in the context of both the serious and the popular literature that would have hovered in the minds of her readers, in order that today's readers may experience the novels as she intended. I wanted to reclaim for us today something of the experience that Austen had prepared for us. The first part of my book examines the common reading culture that Austen shared with her household, and then with a wider audience of friends, and eventually with the reading public. I then read her major novels in the context of other writers that she knew, Georgian novelists like Samuel Richardson, Frances Burney, Charlotte Smith, Maria Edgeworth, Anne Radcliffe, and Mary Wollstonecraft, as well as Scottish poet Robert Burns and the great Glaswegian polymath Adam Smith. He's mostly misquoted today, and the theorists of the picturesque like William Gilpin and Humphrey Repton, along with some more obscure authors of histories and travels. But while recognizing the importance of these writers in understanding Austen, I also argue that her objectives as a writer were different from those of her contemporaries. The standard defense of novels in Austen's day was that they served as didactic instruments of moral education. They had to entertain in order to instruct. They had to show good characters who were improbably perfect and bad characters who were irredeemably evil. And inevitably, the virtuous characters must be rewarded and the wicked ones punished. That was known as poetic justice. Serious novelists before Austen followed these rules. Frances Burney, more than 25 years older than Austen, and famous and admired for most of those 25 years, prefaced her first novel, Evelina, published in 1778 when Austen was just a toddler, with a self-deprecating apology for her trifling production of a few idle hours. She presented her second novel, Camilla, published in 1796, while Austen was drafting the earliest version of Pride and Prejudice, as a work rather than calling it a mere novel. In Burney's preface to her fourth and last novel, The Wanderer, published in 1814, the same year that Austen published her fourth novel, Mansfield Park, Burney defended the novel genre as a didactic tool. What is the species of writing that offers fair opportunities for conveying useful precepts, she asked. It is, or it ought to be, a picture of supposed but natural and probable human existence. It holds, therefore, in its hands our best affections. It exercises our imaginations, it points out the path of honor, and gives to juvenile credulity knowledge of the world without ruin or repentance, and the lessons of experience without its tears. So while Austen applauded what she called Burney's nature and probability, what we would call realism, she rejected that didactic model, even though as a woman and as a writer, Austen was profoundly concerned with moral questions. Her own novels always ironize or complicate any apparent moral lesson, and she had no interest in creating exemplary characters who were either entirely virtuous or entirely villainous. She preferred to write about complex human beings for complex human readers. Her takeaways always require readers to think for themselves. Austen remained a critical reader throughout her short life, reevaluating the novels she read with each rereading, and she reread a lot. Books were expensive. They were rarely purchased, more likely borrowed or rented from a commercial lending library. There was no Atwater Library in those days, or a cooperative neighborhood book society where neighbors would get together, pool their resources, and buy books to share. But however seriously she might read serious works, the playful spirit of her childhood never deserted her, right up to her death, I might say. In October 1813, for example, Jane wrote to her beloved older sister Cassandra. They shared a bedroom throughout their lives, throughout Jane's life, to comment on Mary Brunton's 1811 best-selling didactic novel, Self-Control, which the Austen ladies, and this was Cassandra Jane, their widowed mother, Mrs. Austen, and their good friend Martha Lloyd, who shared Chawton Cottage with them, had already read together at least once. I am looking over Self-Control again, Jane writes to her sister Cassandra, who's visiting relatives in another part of the country, and my opinion is confirmed of its being an excellently meant, excellently written work without anything of nature or probability in it. Later, she mocks Self-Control in a letter to her niece, Anna Lefroy, in which she jokingly promises to write, quote, a close imitation of Self-Control as soon as I can. I will improve upon it. My heroine shall not merely be wafted down an American river in a boat by herself. She shall cross the Atlantic in the same way and never stop till she reaches Gravesend. So she was mocking the improbable. Self-Control was one of the novels Austen had in mind during the last weeks of her life when, mortally ill and in great pain, she wrote a very funny satiric plan of a novel, spoofing popular novels, incorporating all the gratuitous advice that she had received over the years from friends and strangers alike about how to write a novel. And she lists the sources in the margin, so you know where So this is just a portion of it. Heroine, a faultless character in herself, perfectly good, with much tenderness and sentiment, and not the least wit. Very highly accomplished, understanding modern languages, and generally speaking, everything that the most accomplished young women learn, but particularly excelling in music, her favorite pursuit, and playing equally well on the pianoforte and harp, and singing in the first style, her person quite beautiful. Wherever she goes, somebody falls in love with her, and she receives repeated offers of marriage, which she always refers to her father, exceedingly angry that he should not be first applied to. often carried away by the anti-hero, by which she means the villain, but rescued either by her father or the hero. After many vicissitudes, this paragon heroine is rescued by the hero, whereupon Austen assures us that the tenderest and completest éclaircissement takes place, and they are happily united. This, of course, describes the typical sentimental novel that Austen had in mind when she was writing Northanger Abbey. It was familiar to readers from the contemporary courtship novels of Frances Burney and of other well-respected novelists like Charlotte Smith. Her dates were 1749, 1806, so she was a little older than Frances Burney, but she died pretty young. And she was very, very famous in her day, as well as the many hundreds of lesser novel writers whose volumes were filling the shelves of the lending libraries. These novels, good and bad, usually describe an innocent young woman facing perils when she enters society. And while there were variations, such heroines nearly all are lovely and virtuous, and nearly all require rescue from a series of perils by a male figure whose marriage offer is the heroine's salvation. These heroines are always well-born, even noble, although they often appear to be of humble birth, even illegitimate. They are also graceful, pious, benevolent, and accomplished without ever having received any instruction. They struggle to hold on to their values and their virtue while finding a suitable husband. These novels end with the heroine united in a marriage that elevates her to wealth and social eminence, as well as safety from future perils. Virtue is rewarded, vice is punished, poetic justice is satisfied. But as Austen reminded her novel-writing niece, Fanny Knight, around the time that she was drafting plan of a novel in those last months of her life, pictures of perfection, as you know, make me sick and wicked. While her own heroines were imperfect, complex, complicated, Austen endowed them with her own intelligence and integrity, and most significantly, I think, with the capacity to forge their own happy endings. Unlike almost all heroines in previous novels, Austen's heroines possess agency. They're not passively waiting to be rescued. They don't merely react. They act to intervene or to save themselves in ways that moralists and conduct book writers might have disapproved of. Northanger Abbey, for example, opens with a challenge to readers. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her to be born a heroine. Catherine, born into a large, happy family with an adequate income and lacking either remarkable beauty or extraordinary accomplishment, clearly has no potential at all to be a novel heroine. And Northanger Abbey begins like a Frances Burney novel. An innocent young heroine leaves her rural home to be introduced to society at Bath, where she excites the interest of both good and bad suitors. And it ends like an Anne Radcliffe Gothic romance. The heroine is cut off from her friends and protectors, isolated in a remote abbey, and threatened with unnamed horrors by the wicked owner of the abbey, who may have murdered his wife. Very scary stuff. At every step of the way, however, it's the novel's narrator, a stand-in for lazy, unreflecting, cliché-consuming readers, who assumes that Catherine Morland's adventures ought to conform to fictional clichés. Oh no, Catherine says, not being one of those. Oh no, that can't happen to me. That happens only in books. She's nearly always guided by Austen's cherished criteria, what is probable and natural. But the narrator of Northanger Abbey clearly does expect fictional models to play out in real life, measuring Catherine against the typical romance heroine and finding her lacking. Austen's heroine is an ordinary, good-hearted, sensible young woman who interprets reality empirically, but she's also naively trusting. As she learns to navigate the everyday perils of her world, she comes to understand that probability must also include people who behave badly, and they can behave very badly indeed without being full-blown Gothic villains. Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, also challenges our expectations, this time of the exemplary heroines of popular didactic novels with two heroines, published by the thousands throughout the 1790s, but particularly in 1795-96, when Austen first drafted Sense and Sensibility. And like Pride and Prejudice, it was first written in letters and as an epistolary novel, and it was called Eleanor and Marianne. So these two heroine novels usually tell a double courtship story, with one heroine sensible and governed by reason, and the other one emotional and governed by feelings, each representing an opposed philosophical system. They usually refer to their systems. The very title, Sense and Sensibility, suggests that it too will be just such a novel. In the didactic model, the rational heroine must prosper with a happy marriage, while the emotional heroine of sensibility must either fall from virtue and die, or else live out her life in bitter misanthropic isolation. But in Austen's novels, the heroines defy this poetic justice. Marianne Dashwood doesn't die, neither does she live miserably. As the narrator notes with some surprise, Marianne Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. Instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, instead of remaining even forever with her mother and finding her only pleasures in retirement and study, she found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, marrying Colonel Brandon, entering on new duties, wife and mother, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. In Austen's two heroine novel, both heroines achieve happy marriages, and they settle down to raise their families in the same village. Austen's second published novel, Pride and Prejudice, exists in the popular imagination as a perfect wish fulfillment romance in which a lively, attractive, but socially vulnerable heroine wins the heart and hand of the handsome, rich, high-status, much sought-after hero who had earlier rejected her. And don't we all love that story? As such, it has often been interpreted as Austen's reworking of a Burney novel, owing something to Burney's first novel, Evelina, and more to her second novel, Cecilia. At the conclusion of Cecilia, the deus ex machina figure of Dr. Lister manages to reconcile Cecilia's snobbish father-in-law, Mr. Delville, to her secret marriage to his son, which he had forbidden, by reminding him that Cecilia now bears his precious name, Delville, and may one day bear his heir, and should therefore not be left to live in shameful poverty. Having thus recruited family pride as an instrument with which to overcome family pride, Dr. Lister proclaims to the young people, "If to Pride and Prejudice you owe your miseries, so wonderfully is good and evil balanced, that to Pride and Prejudice you will also owe their termination. Such, my good young friends, is the moral of your calamities." Austen's use of that common phrase, Pride and Prejudice, is different from Burney's. The Pride and Prejudice of Austen's title refers to qualities shared by both Darcy and Elizabeth. And while Austen's Lady Catherine de Bourgh is also full of family pride and also forbids the marriage of Elizabeth and Darcy, nobody but Mr. Collins pays her very much attention. This novel, originally called First Impressions, and like Eleanor and Marianne, written in letters, is all about second thoughts and second chances. In Volume 2, Chapter 13, which is the exact physical center of the novel, as Elizabeth reads and rereads Darcy's letter, she recognizes her own culpability. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think, without feeling that she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. Elizabeth's change of heart is written against the grain of conventional Georgian novels. In those novels, the heroine meets and falls in love with the man she's destined to marry early in the first volume, and the remaining volumes detail the contrived obstacles that the lovers must overcome until the happy resolution, which is usually effected by the hero. In Pride and Prejudice, however, Elizabeth is initially attracted to George Wickham, not to Darcy, whom she resents for standing in the way of Wickham's courtship of her. Later, she's attracted to Darcy's amiable cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. Her love for Darcy develops gradually based upon her careful observation and rational reflection, she rereads Darcy just as she rereads his letter, and as she progresses through the accepted novelistic stages, because there was an established sequence of falling in love, of respect, esteem, and gratitude, eventually she comes to love. Even so, when Darcy returns to Netherfield late in the last volume, Elizabeth lies awake 2 hours wondering if she could be happy with him. She knows he's a good man, but would he make her a happy husband? Only when he shows up at Longbourn does she feel herself to be in love, her body even more acutely aware of Darcy than she had earlier been of Wickham. Remarkably, and most unheroine-like, she breaks a conduct book rule of propriety to thank Darcy for saving her sister Lydia, thus ending the embarrassment between them and precipitating his second proposal. In fact, Pride and Prejudice isn't a romance novel at all. It's an anti-romance, dismissing first impressions, love at first sight, and advocating for rationality in choosing a life partner. Elizabeth doesn't wait for Darcy to make the advance. She has agency in a way no virtuous heroine has had before her. Afterwards, she teases him. My resolution of thanking you for your kindness to Lydia had certainly great effect. Too much, I am afraid, for what becomes of the moral if our comfort springs from a breach of promise? For I ought not to have mentioned the project. This will never do. You need not distress yourself, Darcy replies. The moral will be perfectly fair. Lady Catherine's unjustifiably endeavors to separate us were the means of removing all my doubts. In Cecilia, Pride and Prejudice were attributes of the controlling, snobbish father who separated the lovers, and a third party, Dr. Lister, manipulates that pride and prejudice to get the father to accept his son's marriage. In Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice are qualities shared by Elizabeth and Darcy, and no third party is required. Elizabeth's brave transgression brings on her own happy ending. Mansfield Park can be read as an anti-Pride and Prejudice. If Elizabeth Bennet is a heroine who delights all readers, Fanny Price is a heroine that generations of readers have found hard to like. And those of you who know me know that I'm a staunch Fannyite, but I'm the first to admit that Austen deliberately stripped her of wit and charm. Austen is absolutely clear about the need to reject the charms of the Crawford, and she uses that word charm quite precisely in the novel. That's what they do. Austen's best readers, I believe, will always choose the stalwart integrity of Fanny. She lacks the sense of humor, yet she's a true heroine. In fact, in my book, I argue that Fanny is Austen's regendering of the national hero, Horatio Nelson. But Fanny is heroic in the only ways available to a poor, shy, bookish, pious, frail young woman. Her resistance appears to be that of the traditional passive heroine, staving off a distasteful marriage or seduction. But Fanny embraces her role in the same spirit that Nelson embraced his vocation as a young man when he declared, "I will be a hero." Fanny's brother William is a Nelson-like sailor and also a hero. But Fanny's heroism consists not of sea battles, but of battling with her own self, struggling in secret to get the better of her feelings. She's not, as Henry Crawford believes, angelically good, and Austen lets us see this. Fanny feels self-pity, envy, resentment, dislike. No one sees her struggles or what they cost her, but readers see her struggling and struggling along. She knows the lesson that Austen says Sir Thomas learns, that she is born to struggle and endure, and her heroism is in that struggle. Austen's fifth novel, Emma, has often been compared to a female Quixote novel. That's a genre popular in the 18th century, of which Austen was very fond. In her letter, she praises both Charlotte Lennox's 1752 novel, The Female Quixote, and Eaton Stannard Barrett's 1813 novel, The Heroine, which updated the genre. Both of these novels show a young girl who has read too many romantic novels and, like Cervantes' great Don Quixote, imagine that they are living out just such a romance. Yet Austen's Emma Woodhouse is not the usual female quixote figure who thinks she inhabits a romance, and neither, by the way, really was Catherine Morland. Instead, she imagines adventures, intrigues, and romances for other people. She has the imagination of a bad novelist who thinks in fictional cliches. So she misses the real stories that are being enacted in plain sight in Highbury. It's a sort of detective novel. Really fun to read a second time and see where all the clues are planted. She very much enjoys her ordinary, prosaic, everyday life as Miss Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich. In an era of idealized heroines, Emma is singularly real and flawed. Yet many readers, like Mr. Knightley, come to love her in spite of all her faults. Anne Elliot, the heroine of Persuasion, is about a decade older than conventional Georgian heroines. Her failed romance lies 7 years in the past. The novel is about its unlikely resurrection. Thrust onto the urban stage of Bath, Anne learns to act in both senses of the word. While in the first volume she works hard to mask her sad feelings from public scrutiny, in the second volume she performs those feelings, acting out what she feels inside in order to encourage Captain Wentworth to court her again. And when it's clear that he's interested, she acts decisively, intercepting Wentworth at the concert like a bold naval captain cutting out and capturing a prize ship. She takes charge of her destiny as conventional heroines did not. As we watch Anne regain her bloom, her confidence, her cheerfulness, her hope, and her agency, Austen reminds us of the kind of novel she's not writing. Anne's efforts to show her feelings to Wentworth defy all the sage advice in conduct books and conventional novels about feminine modesty and manners. In Burney's 1776 Camilla, for example, the young heroine is cautioned by her dearest father not to show her partiality for the highly eligible Edgar Mandibert. "Risk not, my dear girl," he tells her, "to others those outward marks of sensibility which, to common or unfeeling observers, seem but the effect of an unbecoming remissness in the self-command which should dignify every female who would do herself honor." Another character in Camilla refers to the watchers who observe and judge Camilla's behavior, not only her vigilant parents and members of fashionable society, but also priggish Mandibert himself, guided by his cautious, woman-hating tutor, Dr. Marchmont, who, as Jane Austen joked in a letter, keeps the lovers apart for 5 volumes. I know, they get engaged in the middle, and then you'll wait there's only half a book, so then they get unengaged. Anne Elliot is similarly observed by watchers, but she sees only Captain Wentworth, to whom she's furiously signaling her availability, afraid he will cease to be his formerly bold self. Now she's the bold one. How is the truth to reach him, she worries? How, in all the peculiar disadvantages of their respective situations, would he ever learn her real sentiments? But Anne reminds herself that she is not the heroine of a Burney novel, who keeps finding herself in a misleading appearance that her would-be lover misinterprets. Instead, Anne tried to be calm and leave things to take their course, and tried to dwell much on this argument of rational dependence. Surely, if there be constant attachment on each side, our hearts must understand each other ere long. We are not boy and girl to be captiously irritable, misled by every moment's inadvertence, and wantonly playing with our own happiness. Astonishingly, Anne Elliot now defies conventional rules guiding the behavior of young women, especially if they be novel heroines. Even as she becomes aware that others around her are acting in bad faith, she begins to act herself, performing those feelings for Wentworth so that he might read her heart. Gentle, depressed Anne Elliot, now animated by hope, sends messages of encouragement to Captain Wentworth through friends. She advances to intersect his path at the octagon room. She makes room for him beside her on the bench at the concert. She pleads the cause of women's constancy with all the eloquence at her disposal until the pen drops from his hands. She pierces his soul. She captures her prize. The narrator concludes, when any two young people take it in their heads to marry, they are pretty sure by perseverance to carry their point, be they ever so poor or ever so imprudent. This may be bad morality to conclude with, but I believe it to be truth. Jane Austen, without apology, chose truth over poetic justice, and she gave us a new kind of heroine to live that truth, and my book tries to celebrate that truth. So thank you.